Welcome to the High Rise Podcast, presented by Headset, the leading data and analytics company for the cannabis industry.
Emily, back to the podcast after a week away. Unfortunately, we've never had to take an entire week off, but it was for a good reason. We both were at the fantastic Benzinga conference in Chicago. Although I will say I have one pretty major gripe with the whole conference.
And what is that, Sai?
Well, I think you can guess. Absolutely no pools. So we were unable to do any poolside sessions. You know, in April at Benzinga in Miami, which was also a great conference, happened to have a pool, right? So we could podcast, we could interview. And I know we faked it, here and there. We've, set up inflatable pools, things like that. But it just didn't feel right at the conference, even though, we had the media room, Headset sponsored the media room. Felt like a little weird if we had an inflatable pool in there. I don't think a lot of people understand from the outside if they're not listening. Like, what are you two doing over there next to this inflatable pool doing these interviews? So, next time, Benzinga, I know it's Chicago, I know it's September, but, maybe always warmer climates, or at least have a pool in the area so we can do more podcasting. But what a fantastic event, exhausting event last week in a good way. And a huge shout out to my co-host Emily here for winning an award. It was the award for the most trustworthy investor, which of course you're going to win that, right? Of course, not because this landscape, but honestly, I've known you for years, and I can't imagine anybody else getting that. So congrats on that. Unfortunately, you weren't there to accept, but that's kind of cooler.
I was with a portfolio company.
Exactly, you were working to be fair. And that's cooler anyways, right? To not be there. What would have been even better though is if you had recorded an acceptance speech. Like, I'm on set, on location filming, and like Oscar style, right? I would love to be there, but I'm just so busy. But and next time, maybe they give you more of a heads up. You can record that and then look extra cool.
That's right. And, Rosie and I are always looking forward to a reason to wear, gala attire. So next time I'm up for an award, we're going to get dressed up and go for it. But it was very cool of them. And, Sai, I think we should plant the seed for the Poolside podcast next April at the Benzinga, because it is back in Miami. And maybe we can have our own exclusive cabana again for all of our guests who will be coming by.
Oh, definitely. That is certainly happening. That is certainly happening. I know we've talked to the Benzinga team because we do a lot with them, and I think they really like that we did that, but we kind of just did that on our own, and we'll do it a little more in conjunction with them, which will be even more exciting. It was great. This Benzinga taking a lot of meetings in the lobby like everybody. Yeah, great meetings, but I'll tell you, meetings at a cabana are just much chiller and more fun. So we got to do more of that. We're going into the fall, going into the winter. I'm going to miss the warm weather. And so that Miami Benzinga can't come soon enough. So we'll get in front of it. But I'm sure we'll have other opportunities for great interviews, if not poolsides before then.
Yeah. I mean, I thought it was great meetings, lining up meetings back to back to back with people in person, especially on the backside of the pandemic and all the remote work, has been really valuable. I thought the content was good. I sat in on a couple of sessions and I saw some of the highlights, and there was a bit of discourse coming out of this event around how the leadership of the industry is feeling about what we will see going into this fall election cycle. And I know you and I have talked about this over the several past episodes, but looking into the future, it sounded like there was a little bit of like, well, maybe this doesn't get done before midterms. Maybe it's a lame duck session thing. And of course, I'm talking about the safe banking or any federal reform, because another thing that came up when I was in the halls, I saw some political consultants who I knew through various organizations, and they were talking about the Climb Act as well. So the Climb Act is another piece of legislation around banking and capital markets reform. So there's a lot in the works and a lot of discussions being had. And Sai, I know you pulled up, being the data man that you are, I know you pulled up some data from this recent Newsmax article, which I thought was really interesting, talking about how this is pulling across party lines and other initiatives we see going into the fall election cycle.
Yeah, actually, I mean, speaking of kind of lobbyists and political action, I had a chance to meet Safira Galoob of the Liaison Group. So they're a Washington, D.C. based lobbying firm focused on the cannabis industry. And she gave me a heads up before that Newsmax poll dropped. Like, I think it was like an hour before the news hit. that this was coming. So it's kind of all happening in real time and pretty exciting. And more reason why this event can be so good, just the kind of caliber of people that end up there. But this poll that we're talking about is published on Newsmax. Maybe unsurprisingly, it's not my first publication of choice. I don't really tune into Newsmax much. It's a pretty hard far right conservative publication, but I think that's why this is so exciting, because they ran this, they broke this. And it was a poll where Republican voters overwhelmingly support legal cannabis use. I would also argue not super surprising, not because of like where cannabis is today, but this is like, I don't know, it's kind of old news. Like Republicans have always supported cannabis legalization, particularly when it comes to medical. I think it's that age old story. Everyone knows someone. Everyone's had an experience. They've seen the benefits of medical. So there's that. There's also like the limited government perception of the conservative party, and I think that is something that they want keep government out of my cannabis. So not a huge surprise. I don't think this poll mentioned adult use. I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure it was just focused on medical. But still, the headline is so good, right? It's like, the Republican voters overwhelmingly support this, right? And they want operators to have access to things like banking. And so, just those kind of statements, I think for the audience that they're going after can help change some of the tenor and the perception, especially recently on the high rise. We've talked a fair amount about the kind of the anti-campaign that's, building, right? With kind of trying to bring it back to like gun violence and all this stuff. It's like, where's this all coming from? So now, hey, it polls one way. All of a sudden, I bet they're going to start changing their tune. And as we go into the elections, you're probably going to hear more about, oh yeah, we're totally for this, particularly when it comes to things like access to banking, particularly when it comes to, medical. Adult use, hopefully we get there as more and more states come online with adult use. And that's kind of what I wanted to chat about next, because with the elections coming up, I thought, what states are going to be coming online here? And there are 3 that I saw coming up with things on the ballot. And I think some red states here in this mix. We got Missouri, we got North Dakota, and we got Maryland. So I thought maybe we could talk about Maryland, because that's the one I know most about, and I think is maybe most exciting from a market opportunity, given where they're at with medical. So maybe we can dive into that today.
I think that's a great idea. And, I think this article was great because it did point out the 73% GOP support around the ordinary business support so acknowledging that this industry is an industry and that these businesses are businesses and should be treated like other businesses, which it makes sense, as the GOP has been a business focused party. And I thought, whatever, that's really helpful to understand. And, as we're going into this election cycle, data is going to continue to be, I learned everything I know about politics from Veep on HBO. No, I'm just kidding. But I know they're going to be paying attention to what the polling data shows. And so I think this is really important. And, not to, rain on Nate Silver and some of the things he's called wrong, but I know that analysts will be watching to see what comes next. And I'm certainly going to be interested. Like back when I was on the board of the Marijuana Policy Project is when we had that massive year. I think it was 2016 when I think it was 8 initiatives passed across the states, all but Arizona passed. And we all know now the history of that was that there was funding going into pharmaceutical company that was local to Arizona. So I'm going to be looking at these states, trying to understand what would drive something to be passed or blocked. And also every state has a nuance in terms of the threshold of majority for things to get passed. So I have to dig in to understand how that exists for these 3 different states.
Yeah, and I remember Arizona. Well, I mean, obviously we're in an adult use market, so it's like it's gonna happen. They just kind of postponed it,
Yep.
and I think it was the pharma, and then it was
So.
Discount Tire was the other one. Was the other big one? Yeah, the CEO of Discount Tire.
That was odd.
Yeah, really. It's always tough to be on the wrong side of these things. That's why I go to Costco for my tires. So I want to talk about Maryland. Before we get into some of the data, a couple of things. So Maryland made the news today in quite a big way. So Marijuana Moment, one of our favorite publications out there, reported that Maryland is showing a good amount of support. They reported 59% of Maryland voters said they'd vote to approve the reform. 34% said they'd vote against it, and 7% said undecided. So that seems like a pretty given, at this point. Of course, support was strongest amongst Democrats, 70%, and independents, 53%. A majority of Republicans, 53%, said they'd vote against legalization at the ballot. However, 42% of GOP voters said they'd check the box to pass it. So that's not too terrible, 53 to 42 in all things, considered, just how we've seen this stuff tip on adult use. So strong chance that it's going to pass, which is great. So that was one headline. And then the other headline was
Just
Go
quickly
ahead.
on that though, like those are numbers you can work with. So I remember when we were in Marijuana Policy Project, I'm also involved in CCIA out here in California. And I can't say enough, by the way, about the liaison group. They're always finger on the pulse, and Safira is incredible. But in terms of those numbers, that's a good starting point. And right now, the way things used to work is, you used to spend more time in the early part of the year building up to that issue. But now the way things are, you have to do the real concerted effort as we're getting into the polls. So I would guess that the organizations that are local to Maryland are going to start leaning in on their grassroots efforts to really drive the percentage changes that they need to get that done. And it does seem achievable. So just my 2 cents from what I used to see on the inside there.
Yeah, no, that's great. And yeah, I think it's come a long way, right? Every state used to be such a battle. It seems like a lot of these things, and not that there hasn't been a big effort to get this far, just such a stronger chance, I think, than we've had in the past. So the other big headline was in the Wall Street Journal, of all places, and they're reporting that Maryland has, I think, did you call it equivalent of an MK Ultra program here, which I thought was a clever way to put it. Wall Street Journal obviously didn't say that, but it's kind of in the same vein where, yeah, where it looks like the police in Maryland set up kind of a trial where they had people consume cannabis on site and try to understand, how cannabis may impair behavior. And so that they can, better handle a world where, more people are consuming cannabis and, what that looks like. It's obviously illegal to drive, and it's illegal to drive impaired, whether it's alcohol or cannabis. So I think it's good if the police can understand that. But the whole thing is pretty wild and just kind of a funny headline. Just to think about just being in that room would really stress me out, I think. Just sitting there consuming cannabis as depending on how much you're consuming, and just looking across, and you've got probably a whole host of police officers there just watching you like a science experiment.
No,
So it sounds terrible. There was a funny quote from a 29-year-old said that she was happy to do her part. It says, like her fellow participants, she had a state-issued medical marijuana card, which makes it legal for her to consume pot in the article. She said she had another reason for showing up. She said, quote, honestly, just for the opportunity to smoke in front of the cops without anything happening to me. She said, it's a little strange, but I'm also used to doing strange things because I am a strange person. Which I thought was great. Sounds like a fun person. Anyways, it's good. I think that Maryland is at least getting in front of it. I know other areas have done. Seattle's actually done this. For what it's worth, I think any police education, right, is important. To know what they're dealing with. Hopefully, they don't use it for evil, but hopefully they can understand, what's high risk and what's not high risk as part of the outcome.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's one of those things where I always say, like, if you spend time in a group of people who are consuming cannabis versus alcohol, you quickly realize just how benevolent the force is behind this plant and how people tend to just really mellow out and get along. And there's not nearly half the myriad issues that come with consuming abundance of alcohol. I mean, the way I feel about this is, first of all, I'm hopeful that there was no downside to anybody who signed up for that and now they're on some list, because I just worry for everybody.
That would be terrible.
Yeah, I mean, but the other side to it is, yes, please, let's hold hands and do this together. But then, I mean, are the pharmaceutical companies inviting the police to see what it's like to have a bunch of people pop Xanax and all these other things that I could impact? I don't know. There's a lot of pharmaceuticals that can impair operating motor vehicles, and I think
so many, yeah,
so many. And not to mention if you're taking other things. So for me,
that is
if
a
we're
good
going to have
analogy.
Thanks. Well, if we're going to have an impairment discussion, let's have an impairment discussion. And we are living in a world with Uber, Lyft, and now a bunch of like startups that seem to be trying to disrupt even that. So there's a lot of ways we can navigate this safely. And I am one of those people who would say, if you're impaired on any substance, don't drive, because I think we should try to protect the people of the society. So I'm on board with that, but I just think we should level the playing field and have a broader discussion about impairment and not just a myopic one about cannabis.
Yeah, 100%. So the article's titled, "Welcome to the World's Oddest Pot Party Thrown by the Local Police." At the very least, I gotta hope that the police provided the cannabis. I mean,
I hope it wasn't government weed.
Probably just from the the evidence locker, right?
Oh man! Oh, we don't know if that was tested. Maybe it came from our dear friends at Rise or GTI in Maryland, because they have long been located there.
Yep. There may be a photo of someone in a Rise shirt in the article, so I encourage you to check it out. We'll link to it in the show notes. But before we wrap up here, I can't not talk about the numbers. So I want to look at Maryland versus Massachusetts, and let's think about an adult use world here. After this legalizes this year. So it's going to take a year to get this off the ground or more, depending on if you're New York or New Jersey, whoever you want to look at for Maryland as a parallel. But I did look at population counts, and there's 6 million people in Maryland. You compare that to Massachusetts, which is about 6.8. So I think it's a pretty comparable market. Looking at the Massachusetts market versus the Maryland market is how I want to kind of benchmark it. So Maryland has a medical market today, 102 store dispensaries because it's medical. And you compare that to Massachusetts adult use, what is it, about 230, 235 stores, I think, in Massachusetts right now. Year-to-date sales in Maryland per headset is 337 million. You contrast that with Massachusetts, 962 million year-to-date. This is to September, basically. So we have a full August. We don't have a full month of September. But if you look, it's like double the stores in Massachusetts. It's 235 versus 102, but it's basically triple the revenue, right, for adult use. And so this is where I think the medical, constraints, right? You have to be a patient. I think that is limiting the market a little bit. So there's a lot of, upside here. When it comes to legalization, I was looking at items per transaction. In Maryland, it's a bit more, 3.2 versus 2.5. Average item price is actually a little higher as well, at $32 versus $28, which is about a 12% difference, which makes sense. Medical is just a little more exclusive, obviously a little more expensive. And when people go, they buy a little bit more, right? We've seen this in many markets. It could just be, you maybe buy more because it's for medical purposes. Mm-hmm. Maybe because it's a little more expensive, you just kind of stock up and you don't go as frequently. And then on the basket side, we see about 408,000 baskets in January. I was actually looking at January versus January, and you had 408,000 in Maryland. You had 1.5 million in Massachusetts, and then it's up 4%. In Maryland. So versus that, so we only have about 423,000 baskets in August, only up 4% from the beginning of the year. Where Massachusetts, it's going crazy. It's up 30% in baskets, almost 2 million baskets, going from, roughly 1.5 million baskets to 2 million baskets. And a lot of that's a lot of stores opening up, right? More access is what we always say, right? It's just access. And so, basically Maryland is pretty flat these days in the medical program. You're not seeing a lot more in the way of transactions. Pricing is getting compressed like everywhere, although Maryland prices are a bit higher than Massachusetts prices. So ultimately, I think in the end, Maryland, we have some different projections. It depends on, the timeline for 2025. Do you think the stores will be open by 2025? And, fully operating market with all the licenses? Probably not. But let's say that it does exist. We're looking at a market somewhere between $1 to $1.5 billion annually. And you contrast that with our projections for Massachusetts in a fully functioning market, probably going to be about 1.7, although we're not tracking to that this year. Again, just still more constraints. So I think it's pretty exciting. Should it come to fruition here, I think it's going to be very similar to a Massachusetts market, in the similar area there, obviously much further south than Maryland, but you're surrounded by high populous states, much like Massachusetts is. So, we'll see. But the good news is it looks like it's going to pass. If these polling numbers hold, we'll be watching this closely. And of course, we'll watch the data and see, how this rollout goes.
Thanks for listening to the High Rise Podcast, presented by Headset. For more information on Headset, visit headset.io.